Okay, people are joining. Okay, so people are, shall we wait for a few minutes? I see people still joining in. Yeah, cool. Soft start, I guess. Welcoming everybody joining. Okay. Just a couple of minutes. Nice to see folks I met the previous days. Good morning, good evening to everybody. I'll ask Nicole and Liam to tell us when do you think it's a good moment for us to start. I think we have a nice quorum. Nicole is giving her go ahead, so I think we're gonna go ahead and I'll get us all started. Thanks, Liam, thanks, Nicole. Hello, everybody, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Lara Penin. I am co-chairing this wonderful thematic discussion session with Shana Donahue, who will say hi in a minute. Our panel is about labor, politics, ethics, and governance. Our wonderful panelists, Shana Agid, Kate McEntee, Martina Čaić, and Reuben Stanton. Before we get, they will all introduce themselves in a moment. Before we do anything else, we should do the acknowledgement of country, and our wonderful panelist, Reuben, will do that for us. Can we go to the next slide, Shana? And Reuben, please join us for that. Yes.
Thanks, Lara. Just on behalf of the panel, I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation as the traditional owners of country on which RMIT, and I guess therefore this conference virtually, is located. I'd like to also acknowledge the traditional owners of country on which we all meet and work throughout Australia, and as well traditional owners of any country on which you are all located, wherever you might be in the world. Here we recognise that sovereignty over the land in Australia has never been ceded, and pay our respects to any elders past, present and emerging. Thanks. Back to you, Lara.
Thank you so much, Reuben. Appreciate that. So our title, our discussion today is, as I said, labor, politics, ethics, and governance. We want to unpack some of these issues. It's quite a tall order, I suppose, to to begin to tackle all of these things. We're not pretending here to come up with any definitive ideas, of course, and approaches, but we would rather like to capture key terms and words that our panelists have been anchoring their practice on, and they will share therefore with us and discuss also among themselves and with all of you as well. So we thought we would, the way we thought about organizing today is to try to build a shared lexicon and a shared words and terms to guide our practices, learning from our panelists, as I said. to as a sort of a guiding principles to inform our practice, to inform our methods that we've been discussing so much in the last few days, need to be rethought in many ways, to inform our the briefs of our projects, what kind of projects we even begin to take on, to inform our action in a broader, I guess, political sense, in the way we act in the world in general. So with that in mind, and also very much building upon our previous panels, yesterday's and the day before, depending where you're at, depending what day is for you today. I think we can, what we're gonna do, I think, Sean, can you go to the next slide? So we have asked our panelists to prepare some contributions, and they will share in this following fashion. They will take each one 10 minutes to go over a few terms they have prepared and want to share with us today. And they go one after the other. The idea is that we have a short conversation between the two, and then we have a 10 minutes pause for a Q&A with everybody and between themselves. And then we start with Shana and Martina, and then the second round we go with Kate and Reuben, followed by also 10-minute Q&A. And we will take the temperature of the room if we want to stay together as a collective throughout the panel. That's fine. If we feel there's an appetite, we thought about perhaps opening a few large rooms so we can have a little bit more smaller conversations, but not too small. So if you want to chill, you can continue to do so. Let's get started. I think the first thing would be to introduce ourselves properly. I will start with me. I think I met many of you in the workshop 2 days ago. My name is Lara Penin. I'm an associate professor of transdisciplinary design at Parsons School of Design in New York, the New School University. I was director of a transdisciplinary design graduate program. I co-lead a graduate minor in civic service design, co-founded Parsons Des's Lab. My work is about service strategic design, participatory design, and social justice. I have written a few things about service design. I'm a service design student, most of all. So I will pass it on to my wonderful co-conspirator, and that's Sean.
Thank you, Lara, and thank everybody for joining us today, and a big thank you to the group for indulging, letting Lara and I join them in this kind of amazing conversation. We're excited to be here in the same way that I think everybody is, to be able to have this conversation and discussion. And also just to note that we're also monitoring the chat all the time, and so as things come up, we'll try and enter those in the conversation. But my name, as Lara had said, is Sean Donahue. I am a core faculty member in the Graduate Media Design Practice program at Art Center College of Design, which is in Los Angeles, California. My work predominantly deals with issues of social justice, particularly as it relates to kind of using design as a mechanism to foster participation in policy development by marginalized communities. And so much of my intersections with the topics today are through those lenses. And so thank you for letting me be here.
Okay, Shana.
Hi, thank you, Lara and Sean, for organizing this. I'm super excited to be here. Thank you all for being here as well. My name is Shana Agid. I'm an associate professor at Parsons School of Design, where I am colleagues with Lara. And I also have a art and writing practice, and I come to service design sort of through a range of lenses, but in particular through a history of community-based organizing. So I'm interested, and I'll talk about this a little bit in just a minute, but I'm interested in the ways in which service design is actually a means for thinking about practices that sustain self-determination. And I write on design practice, design research, and design pedagogy, as well as making artist books and being a letterpress printer.
Awesome. We have Martina. Thank you, Shana.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I would first like to apologize if I will be searching for words or having weird sentence constructions because it's already 11:30 p.m. In Finland, where I'm currently located. And it's pitch dark outside, everyone is asleep, but I'm happy to be joining this panel today. My name is Martina Čaić, and I'm an assistant professor in strategic service design at Aalto University School of Arts, Design and Architecture in Finland. I did my PhD in the Netherlands at Maastricht University at the business school, and I was part of the Service Design for Innovation Network, which was an EU-funded project that had 9 PhD students across Europe working on topics on service design and how to advance the field of service design. My research is mostly on social robotics and how different consumers perceive disruptive technologies, how they affect their values, their well-being, and their service experience in general. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you, Martina. We have Kate next.
Hi, everyone. Really happy to be here. Happy to see everyone here and be a part of this panel. Thanks for the invitation. My name is Kate McEntee, and I'm a PhD candidate and a design researcher at Monash University inside WonderLab, which is a co-design research lab. And my research looks at processes and practices of equity, theory, and practice on decolonizing, and looks to how we can translate this really deep and important work into accessible and actionable change with practitioners. And I'm really humbled and honored to be on a panel with so many of my mentors and teachers and people whose work I really admire. So yeah, really happy to be here with you all.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kate. Reuben.
Hi. I think I'm the only non-academic on this panel. I'm a designer. I'm the managing director of a company called Paper Giant based in Melbourne. I'm an RMIT alumni. I have a PhD in interaction design from RMIT. A lot of my work, my been with agents working across the public sector and government sector with a lot of work around access to justice issues and working with governments to better understand and better fund practices and actually tools and solutions that lead to better and positive social outcomes. So I'm really excited to be on this panel with all of you and learn a lot while I'm here. Thanks.
Thank you, Reuben. It's wonderful to have you and everybody else participating in this panel, the discussion together. So we're going to go straight into business, I suppose, and start our discussion of terms. Me and Shana will get us all started by introducing a term each of us to sort of model how the conversation will happen with all the panelists. So I will start with labor. I will start with service labor, considering our service design practice. We know that dramatic changes are affecting how people work. We have seen this through history, but right now because of the COVID pandemic and because of movements such as the Black Lives Matter movement, we have exposed centuries-old issues related to labor and justice and injustice, and while also pushing for change in this space. So the perception of workers in society is quickly changing. And I remember talking about this a year ago and before the pandemic hit and how things have changed since then. And now I think we really finally reckon with the reality of underpaid service jobs being the main protagonist of the workforce worldwide. We now see and recognize essential workers. We now understand what remote work might mean, and those who have not the ability to do work remotely. And we also reckon with unprecedented precariousness and unemployment. And as service designers, we are not simply and practitioners, we are not simply observers. We cannot be simply simple observers of all this ongoing transformations, but we urgently need to expand an understanding of labor, and specifically service labor, because what we do, what we make, the decisions we make in our work affect our actions, right? Everything that we do, the objects of our designs, physical, digital, but also management and policy, may have and will have a direct impact on workers and their work conditions. So rather than being helpers in relation to service workers, I call for a worker-centric service design and repositioning our practice through a sense of solidarity between designers and workers, and really bringing forward understandings of what does it mean to design, considering essential labor, aesthetic labor, emotional labor, care labor, invisible labor. So for me, labor, politics, ethics, and governance as a whole starts with this reckoning, starts with recognizing the labor infrastructure we're in, and that needs to be redesigned, and starting by valuing care-based essential labor. So that's my initial push into this. I have a tool that I've designed and I played with some of you before that tries to help us rethink labor based on where we are and new understandings of labor and new understandings for service design in relation to that. I will pass it on to Shana to talk about politics that directly connects with labor.
Thank you, Lara. Just a quick offering, as Lara said, to frame some of both what each of us are going to do, but also the terms of our discussion. Relative to politics and my practice is kind of recognizing the contradictions between much of both literal, the service and the design contributions that go into the world, and not just who they're from or who they privilege or what they privilege in them, but the contradictions that are embedded in how they're manifested and how these infrastructures are created, manifested, supported, and how that does or does not marginalize or exclude, and in many cases exploit members of our society in order to facilitate that and to foster that, and the politic that's involved in producing that, and how more specifically, one of the offerings I would put forward is, how are the mechanisms that we use to engage within service design, within design proper even, considering that politic and those contradictions, and addressing it in a way that isn't simply about advancing participation, because there's lots of ways of participating, but that expressly include ways of addressing the politic that advances some and marginalize or subjugates others. And to the right are two projects from my own work. The project at the top is Who Does the Future Belong To? It's a series of stills out of industry future films from Fortune 500 companies around technology that very clearly presents a future that's made for white, high income earners, many in relationship to the domestic space, a very gendered orientation to that nonetheless. So the future is for a very particular community, and the imagery below it is of migrant laborers in the Middle East who are literally building that infrastructure. And there's quite a bit of service design that's going into how to care for them, appropriately or not, but maybe less going into who actually gets to benefit from the future that they're manifesting in equitable ways, or in ways that is, to Shana's point, building in each other's worth and aspirations in the world. So I offer that as part of the discussion. Thank you, Laura, and I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you, Sean. We jump into Shana's first contribution. Shana, giving you the floor.
Thank you. And you may hear in the background, speaking of labor, some 9th grade student conferences happening on the other side of a very thin wall in a very small house. So, so this first image is of a pod mapping diagram. It's from the Bay Area Transformative Justice Coalition. I'm actually going to pop this in the chat right now so folks can go and use this to build your pods. But what I wanted to talk about with this image is that this image, which really was built by BATJC to begin imagining ways that people can build some specific kinds of networks of care and support around addressing violence and the potential for violence and harm in our relationships, has also become, over the course of the pandemic, a basic resource that people are using to build mutual aid networks in a range of different ways, whether for food distribution, housing access, money exchange, et cetera. And I brought this up because one of the things that is compelling to me about this image is that it grows out of a use of the word community, feeling to people who are doing community-based organizing like community was actually such an abstract concept when you actually got down to it. When someone had suffered harm, when someone was at risk of harming somebody, who were the actual people you could turn to? And how do we begin to recognize who those folks are around us and build those skills? So in thinking about the idea of mutual aid and thinking about the networks that we build to actually deliver what we might think of as services, but are also relationships and forms of care, one of the questions that comes up for me all the time, and I think this relates deeply to what both Lara and Sean just shared, is what is the role of the state in sustaining well-being? And what are our sort of political ideas even about that? I think the slide just disappeared for a second, just so you know. Okay. So in my work, I tend to think about service design as a means for engaging questions and imperatives around how people name needs and desires, identifying existing or attainable resources, and then designing systems that bring those resources to meet those needs or desires. So this way of thinking about the value and aims of a service or a service system bring into view in my mind other kinds of questions, like how do power, access, and notions of help or need inflect or direct the idea of who organizes, who funds, and who benefits from a system? And especially the notion oftentimes, especially in the nonprofit sector, that these are fixed and separate positions: who benefits, who organizes, who funds, who provides. So what systems look like that grow out of things like mutual recognition, necessity, and just good looking out for one another. So mutual aid, which is a term that is sometimes contested. Lara also used the term solidarity to talk about the position that designers might take with workers. So oftentimes folks who do mutual aid also talk about it just as solidarity work. Has seen a kind of explosion since the pandemic began, as I mentioned. But it's really based in practices, age-old practices, I would argue, that are grounded in the survival and thriving organization of marginalized people. So African-American social clubs in a US tradition, networks of queer women who worked as HIV and AIDS caregivers in the 80s and 90s when the largely male-identified folks around them were dying, but queer women were oftentimes able to do that caregiving. Or containers for transformative justice created by people who are looking to address harm without involving police and prisons. And this language of containers is really interesting to me. I'm doing work right now with an organization, well, not a loose affiliation of people called the New York City Transformative Justice Hub. And a piece of what they talk about are what it looks like to proliferate many containers to ultimately undo the use of policing and imprisonment as a way of addressing harm. So Sean, could you flip to the next slide? Thank you. So the complexity of these kinds of contexts and investments in holding on to the mess of real life while still working to imagine or shape or insist upon forms for organizing our labor, our relationships, or our power lead me to always in my work think about the utility of mess, of in-between spaces, for instance. So one of the questions that's always core to me for thinking about when and where to use service design and in what ways and how to really even talk about it with people is to think about what kinds of systems, services, and infrastructures, and even what kinds of meanings we can make when we design with these sort of productive tensions of ambivalence, of not knowing, of being partway there, or being in two places or two times at once. So finally, and this is my last slide, Sean, sorry, thank you. This brings me to the question of practice. And the image that you're looking at is from a group of posters that are publicly available that, that ask questions that are at the center of restorative justice practices, which is slightly different from transformative justice, which I'm happy to get into. But the idea of practice is at the core of so many of the mutual aid or solidarity practices that I'm talking about. The notion of practice as a thing that you do with the acknowledgement that you are going to mess up, the acknowledgement that you're not going to get it right for the first time, that in fact you might get it wrong many, many times. And it is through that work that one becomes expert, but where expertise is not a moment of separation, a moment of difference or differentiation. It's just a moment of having practiced enough to feel like you can do things with the people around you. And so in this sense, practices through which we do the kinds of things that I've been talking about so far, is something I would argue is endemic not only to living, but living under conditions one seeks to change on the one hand, or with capacities one seeks to improve or to hone. So it's a means for creating and sustaining complex community and for passing down knowledge over time. What are the questions then that we use to enter into practice? And maybe most importantly, what are the questions practice leaves us with, and how do we learn to work with those? So as practices for making and for knowledge production, one question that I take with me through this work is what can we learn about the work of practice from the long-standing practices of those outside design? So in other words, how can we, where I think in many ways within service design, in fact, we have a really robust way of thinking and talking about practice and understanding practice as a form of research, a form of knowledge making, and a form of a very, very real and practical production of all the kinds of both material and emotional things that Lara was talking about. One question I have is how do we learn from those who have robust practices in the world without then claiming those practices for or as design, right? So where do we sit in tension, in relationship, and in sort of the potentials for co-working with folks who have long established practices and ways of learning and knowledge production as well. So I'm gonna wrap up right there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shana. We have Martina coming next. Martina.
Yeah. Yes, thank you, Lara. And thank you, Shana, for sharing your topics. I think they were really fascinating. And I mean, I'm a bit overwhelmed with everything that you shared. And I would like you to have more time to share more of your experiences with us. And as already you mentioned, it overlaps a lot with what Lara and Sean were talking about earlier, but it also overlaps with a lot of things that I'm doing, like the importance of community and transformation, meanings and value. And I'm pretty sure it's going to overlap also with what Kate and Reuben are going to talk about a bit later. But I would be curious to hear if there is maybe one short practice or like research related to the topics that you would just like to briefly share with us that maybe you've been working on recently to kind of give us a bit more context on how you practice all these topics that you've discussed now.
Yeah, thank you so much,
Just a
Martina.
brief one.
Yeah, of course. So I think one of the ways that this comes up in the work that I do, and I think this dovetails. So for those of you who are at the session that I was part of yesterday, this dovetails a little bit with that, is through thinking about the sort of what else gets made in the practice of design, right? So and I think this becomes particularly interesting in terms of thinking about long-term participatory practices where we're fundamentally building relationships. It's something that actually a colleague of Sean's, who I've had the great pleasure of writing with, Elizabeth Chin, calls taking it, how does she actually phrase it? Oh, now I can't remember it. Such a good pithy phrase. anyway, hopefully I'll come back to it. But essentially people going off and doing their thing. That's what Elizabeth talks about, right? So the idea that as designers, we may engage with a group of people for a short-term or a long-term period of time. We may be invited into a space and stay in that space for months or years. But that what we actually end up doing through practice is not necessarily predictable and is oftentimes different to or even opposite to what we thought we might be doing. And so I think the example that I would sort of use for that is from work that I am still doing with in fact, the school that is happening on the other side of this wall, is part of what we do is think about what needs to get made from year to year through this undergraduate class that I teach, that I actually adopted from Lara many years ago now, that is a service design studio that's really focused on collaboration. And one of the things that has become really clear in that class is that while it is incredibly important that we make something real and lasting, that thing is only ever at the very beginning or at the midstream in that in the course itself. And so a piece of the learning, a piece of the practice in the course is learning how to enter something that is not yours, become and build an affinity, a respectful affinity, and leave that thing knowing it will still be built without you, and recognize that also as the role of a designer, right? So it is not authorial. It is not originating, but it is in fact about sort of the consistency of relationship and seeing what gets built from there. So I think that maybe that's one example of kind of the practice in that sense.
Yeah, Shana, I have a question for you around the work. Kind of, you left us on this idea about how we can learn from other practices, and as we sit in relationship with them without owning or appropriating that kind of practice or knowledge or way of working that another practice might do that's longer established. In your work, have you come across examples of other fields that do that really well, that really sit in relationship with other practices and are able to, I mean, I don't know what that word is, adopt or work alongside or be strengthened by those relationships without then owning it and saying, oh yeah, this is what we do too?
The short answer is no, but that might be my ignorance, right? I mean, what I immediately think of though, Kate, is coalitional practices, again, like coalition building. Mm-hmm. There was a friend and comrade of mine, Ari Wolfeiler, I once heard describe coalition as a kind of intersection of collaboration and participation. So meaning that that it is an intentional way of being in relation to others that is not necessarily always about sameness. Oftentimes it is very much about managing difference, right? Different politics, different ways of working, even a different set of desired outcomes. And I think oftentimes what it requires is deep learning in order to be able to make strategic decisions to do work together, right? And so I think where people come together sort of to do coalition building work is where I see that, just again, this is obviously just in my own experience, but where I see that happening the most, right? I mean, I think the trouble with academic disciplines is that academic disciplines are nearly always trying to take things over for their own, right? So they're like, this is, you know, we are going to master this knowledge and then become the lens through which it is accessible to others. And it's an interesting opportunity for design, both in sort of in a industry sense, but also in an academic sense, to imagine what a more relational or even coalitional position might be. But I think even some more radical academic fields end up in that, sort of making a box around things and trying to contain them. But there's a really interesting piece by Linda Burnham, a Black feminist activist, who writes about the knowledge production that happened in Black feminist and Black queer organizing, and the idea that that things that we come to understand or know, that some of us come to understand or know through academic language or through academic practices often are generated through movements, right? And so I think part of it is also being able to recognize where knowledge making happens and being able to sort of align with it without feeling like, you know, the only way to work with it is to own it in any sort of literal or figurative sense. I think it's a great question.
Shana, we have just 1 or 2 minutes before we move on to Martina, but Courtney in the chat has asked if you could speak more to a little bit of the difference between restorative and transformative justice practices and how that relates.
Yeah, and so Courtney, what I'm going to say is I'm a novice. So my political background that brought me into this work actually is that I work toward the abolition of the prison industrial complex, so prisons, policing, surveillance, and related sort of structures. And a turn that I've taken in my own personal practice recently has been trying to learn more and understand more about transformative justice and other kinds of ways of addressing harm when it happens. And so in that work, part of what I'm doing is some research with a handful of people organized into this group, the Transformative Justice Hub in New York City. And one of the things that I've learned through that work is that there is a sort of nested set of practices and approaches, community accountability, transformative justice, and restorative justice. And I think oftentimes those things seem like they are the same things, just with different names. And one of the primary differences, I understand it, and again, I'm a novice, but the primary difference between transformative justice and restorative justice is that restorative justice tends to be rooted in institutions, right? So you would have restorative justice practices in a school or in an alternative court. And transformative justice is intentionally always outside of a system. So it might be rooted in an organization, but there's not a sort of official practitioner that someone goes to, but rather it grows up out of, you know, again, sort of loosely, it's a complex word, but out of community, right? So it's not within an institution in the same way that restorative justice is, although many of the actual practices are shared.
There are a few questions here on the chat. Sean, I don't know how we're doing it on time.
I think I think we should invite Martina to present her offerings, and then just a reminder, at the end of Martina, we'll have some additional time for Q&A and reflection also before we move into Kate and Reuben.
Sounds good. So we are going back to the chat questions, everyone, later. For now, Martina, please go ahead.
Thank you. Well, the first topic I would like to discuss today is robotic labor. And as you can see from the first sentence, it states that about 50% of workers globally could see themselves replaced by automation before 2030. And that's automation beyond just robotics, but I included here, it's according to the European Commission foresight. Robotic frontline employees or consumer-facing robots have already been employed in hospitality. For example, you might have seen them in hotels or restaurants, in retail, in supermarkets, in education. They're already helping in class as a teaching support. In healthcare, maybe surgical robots performing laparoscopic operations, and in elderly care, where we have care robots, or what we call also socially assisted robots. And for now, they're mostly performing these time-consuming, tedious, and repetitive tasks. And according to some recent research, they can already perform that on a human level, even for some tasks beyond the human level. But the question that I raise here is, how are they going to perform when they would have to do not only the thinking task, not only the mechanical and analytical task, but also the emotional and feeling tasks? And here on the slide, you can see some pictures from the research, the field research that I've been doing together with my team for the last 5 years or so on socially assistive robots in elderly care. And these socially assisted robots are robots that can understand social cues through their facial and voice recognition technology, and they can interact with humans in a human-like manner. And what we found through in-depth interviews with different stakeholders and observations, generative techniques, and field experiments, we wanted to understand how elderly people, but not only elderly people, but also their formal caregivers, so their nurses or doctors, and their informal caregivers, family and friends, perceive such robots affecting human values and, for example, privacy, safety, self-actualization, and independence, their well-being, and their health. So as Lara was saying that she's introducing this worker-centric service. In my research, I am advocating for a network-conscious approach to service design. What we found out, and I'm just going to be very brief with the findings, because as I said, it's a 5-year-long project, but some of the main takeaways from the elderly, from the perspective of the older adults, is that there are clear tensions how they perceive the role of the robot in their future networks of care. From one side, they perceive them as enablers because they can be very quick reaction in case of an accident, but they also see them as intruders because they are constantly monitoring them. They're like a big brother and they're affecting their privacy, a lot of ethical issues being raised there. When it comes to their psychosocial health, they perceive robots as allies. So someone they can talk to, which was especially important now during the COVID pandemic. But at the same time, they see them as a replacement. So they really fear that they're going to take away human contact from them and that they're going to replace their human caregivers. And finally, when it comes to their cognitive health, they see it as an extended self, sending reminders, updates about medication. But then at the same time, they say, oh, it's also a deactivator because I'm not going to be thinking by myself anymore and I want to continue using my brain. So there are always these trade-offs that they see when it comes to these more of a feeling or social robots in their care networks. Sean, maybe we can move to the next slide now. Kind of related to the previous topic, because most of my research is with these new emerging technologies, is related to AI or the artificially intelligent machines, and it's defined as algorithmic bias, which is a systematically unfair algorithmic outcomes which arbitrarily advantage one group of people over another. For example, Shana was also talking about criminal justice. In detecting shoplifters, there is a bias against people of color. They're being targeted by the video cameras and they're being more watched for, hence they're also caught more in shoplifting. There were also examples of the recruitment AI. For example, Amazon was experimenting with some machine learning to build a recruitment tool, but then they had to abandon it because they found out that it was discriminating against women. And then maybe a more recent example is from Apple Card, that Apple Card users have alleged that the credit decision algorithm discriminates against women. So these are many examples that are currently emerging at the surface. And we ask, what can we do with this as service designers? And this is where this image comes to the play. It's from a master thesis project I did with a student a couple of years ago, where she interviewed CEOs and AI specialists at the telecommunication company, and she was showing them different images from Google search. For example, here it was a search for family. And she also searched for the boss or the CEO or beautiful hair or happy kids. And then she was showing them these pictures and asking them if they can discuss what they see at their Google results. And probably you can see easily now when you look at this image is that, all the families are white or majority of families are white, heterosexual families. When it comes to beautiful hair, it was white women. When it comes to happy children, white kids. And of course, when it comes to CEO or the boss, it was only men. What was interesting, what she found was that the people only perceived the bias when they were the ones being discriminated. So only in our sample, only women realized that only men were in this Google search when she looked for the CEO or the boss. So the algorithmic bias is often unintentional, and it's difficult to follow the chat, but I think someone was saying something about humans biasing as well, and that's exactly the case. So the algorithms are being designed by humans, and the bias comes from humans. So the question is, how can we then become aware of all these issues that we are putting into the algorithm, and how can we include disciplinary teams and service designers also on the teams to avoid and mitigate these unwanted biases in the future. And then this brings me to my last topic, which is the most recent research I've been working on is on diversity and inclusion. And it's a PhD work of my PhD student, Anuka Svanda at Aalto University. And we are looking into diversity and inclusion of international residents in Finland. Just to give you a bit of context, I'm currently living in a municipality with the highest number of international residents in Finland. And the political discourse around the globe oscillates between portraying international residents as either friends or foes. Just recently, a Danish prime minister said that she wants country to accept 0 asylum seekers. So public service providers are thus faced with the challenge of scaling up diversity and inclusion, but being pushed with the different institutional hindrances. And for this project, we are working with the local municipality in developing a service for a sustainable employment of highly educated international residents in Finland. And what is very interesting is that you can see some personas here that Anuka was developing from her interviews. These are the pictures. What is interesting is that they wanted to employ her as a service designer. They already recognized the importance of having service designers on their team. And the municipality representatives are taking courses at Aalto University to build capabilities, service design capabilities within their teams. However, they're still facing institutional inertia and the implementation paralysis in making the projects come true. And throughout this conference, I've realized many of you are working with government and in public sector. And I'm also curious to hear from you of your experiences in working on this topic and fighting the institutional inertia and the implementation paralysis. Thank you.
Thank you, Martina. And I think Shana is Martina's discussant, yes?
No, I think I'm the discussant for.
You are,
Kate.
sorry, Kate, apologies.
Yeah, no worries. Thanks for that, Martina. It was really great, and really in all 3 projects you highlighted there, I have a lot of things I'd like to dig in on. But what I want to ask is kind of thinking about Shana's concept about practice, and that we have to practice and we're going to mess up, and we build an expertise through putting those things out in the world. And then how you were talking about building network consciousness rather than kind of a singular focus on network consciousness, and recognizing that in these practices that you're looking at, there's a lot, we're seeing discrimination happen widely. How do we, what's the relationship between that? We know we're going to be using algorithms. We know we're going to be using robots in social spaces. And we know that putting them out there in the world is creating real discriminatory kind of results in people's lives. And yet there's a tension in that. How do we learn how to use these? How do we learn this work moving forward without doing that practice? How do we build a network consciousness without doing these things that are causing harm in the world at the same time?
Yeah, Kate, thanks for your question. It's a question that I don't have a clear answer to how can we do that, but I think we should try to become more aware of the different stakeholders involved in all these different services. If I go back to my first example with the robots, I only focused on what elderly people were saying. However, if we look at what the formal caregivers and informal caregivers were saying, we can see another layer of tensions there. So it's a layer of tension already within one stakeholder group, but then adding additional, or the network perspective makes it even more difficult to kind of find a solution that fits everyone, or that is good for everyone, or that improves the well-being of everyone being involved. But then for the, in case, again, coming from the marketing background and from the business background, in my PhD, I had to also think about the adoption of such technologies. And when it comes to social robotics, there is a problem of the lack of healthcare staff. And it's not that we are introducing such robots to replace the healthcare staff, or I'm not advocating for that in my research for sure, but there is a lack of healthcare staff. And also the informal caregivers are not having time to care for their elders as they had maybe 50 years ago when they were living all in the same community, in the same house. So what we found is that elderly people might be very resistant towards robots, but then when they put themselves in the network of care, and when they start understanding what are the benefits for my child, that my daughter is going to be unburdened by this robot, and that my son is going to have more time to spend with his children and not call me every day to check whether I'm doing great, then they are becoming a bit more open towards new technologies. Then they say, okay, maybe I said in the beginning that I don't want them, but now I kind of see the value. So that's why I think it's very important to kind of surface these networks and understanding, because it can change also the perspective of the people being involved in the or being affected by the technology. I hope that answers your question.
Any follow-ups, Kate, or shall we? I don't know. I had a question, Martina. I was listening to you, and you said there's a lack of healthcare staff. So you're saying that it's a given that we will have care robots, or is it? I guess I'm trying to be slightly cynical and imagine the pressures that come from technology.
I'm happy to be cynical. I'm happy to be the cynical one if you need me to, Lara.
Yes, please, Sean, build in. I'm just thinking, Sean is in California. He can perhaps be the best person to ask about the pressure from technology, be companies and houses to sort of think of this as a given. It's something that we need to accept. And I wonder, I'm posing to you because you've been studying this so much. Shall we just accept that, or shall we resist that? Perhaps, is there room for that, or is it futile?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think we should resist, and there are spaces where we can still design for a better future. So it's not that we just accept what the technology or the technology developers think should be the better future. The thing is that what we know now is that they can perform these maybe more analytical or mechanical tasks. But from my research, everyone was saying that they don't want the human hug to be replaced by a robot, or they don't want to just have these. They didn't believe that the conversation is ever going to be genuine with a robot. So the whole focus was kind of shifted more towards, okay, let's have robots to do the tasks that are taking away time from the nurses, to give them more time to spend this quality time with the elderly people, so that it's not about robots replacing nurses completely and also trying to take the empathic element of, or the feeling element of the care economy, but rather that they take over the tasks that are burdening them giving them more space to then provide care for elderly people.
Thanks for these thoughts, Martina. I wonder if, Sean, shall we open the discussion? Anybody else in the panel would like to pose a question to Martina?
We have a few questions in the chat as well, so yeah.
Go ahead with that, Sean.
Sure, and this is kind of questions for Martina and Shana, for that matter. This is the first one's kind of directed at maybe both of you, but Shana maybe introduced the idea of invitation and how this invitation impacts power dynamics and knowledge making. And I would offer that to both of you that way. Martina, I think you're articulating a very particular power dynamic between technology and humans, and Shana, you kind of introduced that through the idea of invitation as well. So,
I mean, I can start, Martina. I think so I think, and I've actually written about invitation in relationship to design. I think I don't think that invitation necessarily, I mean, nobody's suggesting this, right? An invitation does not undo or guarantee even a conversation about power dynamics. But I think that there has been a real emphasis, maybe especially in service design, maybe in part because of its relative newness as a field, and the idea of the designer as an activist, or the designer as a trigger, or the designer who shapes the questions that will be asked. And I think that invitation has the potential to undo a lot of that dynamic. Of course, it still requires the people who are inviting and invited to make a decision together to talk about power, right? To have a conversation about power, or how to set the terms of what a relationship or a working relationship might be. But I think that I think even the question of have we been invited, and to what have we been invited, and with whom, and to what ends, to me, I feel like is a really critical question, and I think one that engenders or requires a kind of humility that is not necessarily typically imagined as a characteristic of design or designers. So in that sense, I think invitation functions on multiple levels, right? Like there's being invited into someone's work, and then there's being invited to ask your questions or their questions. There's being invited into conversation. There's obviously, being invited to share things that are other than the work that also become the work, right? A meal, or a time of helping out with something else, right? Like that kind of thing. So I don't know. I mean, I would say from the position of being a designer or a design researcher who gets interested in things and then is trying to figure out with whom to do that work, an invitation is a really active, is a really important component of it, right? If no one is inviting you to work with them, I think it does raise questions about whether that is a good place for the work to be happening. Now, maybe that's less true with different dynamics. I don't know. I mean, I guess it depends on whether you're trying to sneak in. It depends on the power dynamic, right? If I'm trying to sneak into some space unnoticed and learn some things that people don't want me to learn, so that I can undo their power, maybe I don't want to be invited. But I do think that in most of the work that I'm interested in, there is this, when one joins in the work together, that is often through invitation, and it creates an opening to have a different dynamic. But I don't, I think it's important to say it doesn't automatically undo the power dynamic. It's more like it invites a conversation about it in a different way. I'm also immediately thinking, Martina, about the idea of invitation in relationship to, well, really all three of the topics that you raised, and thinking about the tensions in the relationships that people have in the senior care environment you were talking about with the robots, and what that, I mean, so I actually think it applies so much to all three of the terms that you raised, but that question of sort of wanting and not wanting something at the same time as part of that service dynamic or part of that dynamic with technology is really interesting to me, and was one of the questions I was actually going to ask. So I'm curious your thoughts about this invitation question.
Yeah, thank you, Shana. I was thinking about the power dynamics, and my first thought always goes back to when I first started working with the roboticists and the engineers, and I did my stay during the PhD in Portugal. And what I realize is that the roboticists and the technology developers are usually, males in their 30s, and it's very difficult for them to put themselves in the shoes of an older adult who is 60, 70 years old. And what they really need is someone to invite the participants and translate what they are saying, because they also speak a different language. What I really found super interesting is that they would be developing technologies that completely, I mean, I was shocked, when they would be developing sensors that they would want to put around the thighs of an elderly person, and then we would go into the field, and then I would be like, but you're not thinking, elderly ladies wear skirts, and we will have to lift their skirts up and expose them in front of everyone to just put the sensor around their legs. So only like these simple things are happening, and there is no one is thinking about, I mean, or at least the people that I've been working with haven't been thinking about that. So I think that's why it's very important for the invitation to have everyone or different groups of people involved, so that also we open the eyes for the ones that are developing the technologies, because I really truly believe that that all the issues that arise come really unintentionally, and it's not really that they want to hurt or put anyone in a discomfortable position.
We have a follow-up question for Martina by Hazel that's asking a couple things. Some things around the terminology. Do robots have to replace a workforce? Can they enhance it? And how does that happen? I see you have some comments about that. But also, have you talked to healthcare workers and how are they responding to this, and what is their point of view on that?
Yeah, thank you, Hazel, for the question. Yeah, as I was saying already earlier, absolutely not. The replacement is not, was never something that we advocate in our research. It's always kind of an in addition to a healthcare professional, or some kind of supplement, kind of extending the workforce that we currently have. And the question about what were their thoughts is really interesting, because I've talked with many healthcare professionals in the Netherlands and in Portugal and in Croatia, and they all seem very, relaxed about robots. Like, robots, they will never be able to replace us. We don't worry about them. They will, they will never be able to do the job that we are doing. But I was engaging with them with this mapping technique. They were mapping the networks of care with actor network cards. And then there was also, they would map the network of elderly people and everyone involved in the care. And then they had to introduce the card of a robot. And while elderly people and informal caregivers would all put the robot right next to the elderly person's card, formal caregivers would put it really far away from the elderly person. And then I thought that was a very, very interesting finding, because they were saying that they don't fear, but then when they were making these networks, they were showing by their action that they actually don't want the robot to be there, or that, and then when I would ask them, but how do you think the robot is going to help the person if the robot is not there, right next to that person? And then they would be like, yeah, right. And then, they would think about maybe moving the card closer. So I think that there is really, that they also don't feel, they are afraid, for sure. They're afraid, but they are not explicitly saying that. At least they were not saying that in the interviews that we had.
There's a second part of that offering that Hazel put in the chat, which is if robots start to take over some of the more scientific labor that healthcare workers are doing, will that free them up potentially to do some of the more emotional things that maybe are being filled in other ways right now, particularly in Western aging care concepts?
If I got the question correctly, so if the robots are going to be doing more of the mechanical tasks, whether that's going to leave more space for the healthcare professionals to do care?
A notion that Hazel had offered is that maybe a lot of the care providers' time is taken up doing a lot of these kinds of responsibilities, and if that was taken over, if that part was taken over by robots, which somebody else offered is already happening with small things like saline drips and things of that nature. Do you see that opening up other kinds of opportunities for care providers to address these other more human to human kinds of responsibilities?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I already talked about that earlier. That was kind of my main point, that exactly if the robots take these smaller tasks, or if, I mean, maybe there is already, maybe not even just the smaller tasks. There's already research it's not part of my research, but it's research being done, with people maybe feeling more comfortable undressing in front of the robot and being showered or bathed by a robot than a human caregiver. So maybe these tasks are also going to be something that we need to look into. But for now, if they're taking more of these repetitive tasks, or bringing towels like in hotels and things like that, then for sure nurses would have more time to sit with the elderly person and really engage in a meaningful conversation that nowadays they are struggling to find time to do that. And just being in this context for 5 years now, I can definitely say that older adults are not only experiencing objective isolation, but also subjective isolation and loneliness. And they really need someone to talk to and someone to sit next to them and listen to them and all their stories for hours. And nurses, unfortunately, don't have time for that.
Thank you, Hazel, and thank you, Martina. Hazel, I hope I did your very thoughtful questions in the comment sections of justice. But Martina, I would direct you towards Hazel's. I think it seems like you have a lot to share with each other. And I would direct everybody to the chat. There's been a lot of references offered in this discussion, and so I would encourage everybody to take some time, and as well as some back and forth conversations happening there. Lara, that brings us to the end of the kind of Q&A for our first two presenters, for Shana and Martina.
Sure thing, Shan. So we can still circle back to, there are several questions left unanswered and points that kind of started to emerge, but we can go back to that. I suppose at the end we have more elements. I think it would be nice to have Shan, the next two panelists bringing their contributions in. Shall we go to the next slide and start with Kate talking about her keywords here. Kate.
Great, thanks, Lara. That conversation was great. I feel like we could take up the whole next hour just looking at Martina and Shana's work. I was really into it. So I took a real literal view of creating a word and defining it in hoping to kind of really highlight encapsulate some concepts that I think are really important in regards to ethical practice in our service design. And I want to start out by framing these concepts with the very unsurprising admission that my perspective is Western dominant. And though I bring a lot of awareness to try and mitigate that fact in my work, it is because of these efforts that I want to highlight that's the perspective that I'm bringing here today. About service design, about politics, about ethics. It's been very much shaped by white Western US cultural context that I came from. And so the terms that I'm introducing here are a reflection of that positionality in the world, and so likely more pertinent or resonant perhaps with people who share a similar positionality to myself. So my first term, which you see here on the screen, I kind of made up a word. And there's maybe even a word out there that does this that I just didn't know better. But the term appropriate has been defined here in close relation to the terms appropriate, appropriate, and inappropriate. But in its creation, I'm seeking to highlight something very particular and distinct for our discussion here around service design. So appropriate as a term is a term as a verb that indicates actively understanding when something is not for you, not to be adopted, not to be taken or owned or known by you. And in adjectival form, something that's not suitable for a particular purpose. For example, it might be unsuitable to use this as a design insight on your project. So the example from my work that I want to share happened just a couple weeks ago in a moment working on a project with a colleague about high school experiences in the United States. And the person I was working with is a Black woman who went to high school in the South. And she was sharing a piece of writing in which she included this detail, quote, "the tall, pretty, light-skinned 3C hair girl," end quote. And when I read this, I didn't know what 3C hair meant. It didn't even occur to me that it related to what you can see here on the screen, which is a chart that types curly hair based on the wave or coil pattern. And as my colleague and I were discussing the work, we talked about the fact that I didn't know this detail. And what did it mean for her to include a detail in her story that might not be known to the audience members or some of the audience members? And rather than offering a footnote or some kind of asterisk to explain it in detail, the value in recognizing that not all details are there for everyone to know or use, and that when someone does know or understand that detail, it might indicate a particular relationship to the work. So learning what 3C hair meant in this instance, or even if we can imagine a parallel experience of, say, doing design research, working in a high school, interviewing someone, and learning this detail, that learning does not now give me permission to know what 3C hair means. I still don't know what it means to be the light-skinned girl with 3C hair walking down the hallway, though I can look at a hair chart. So I offer appropriate as a term to describe not the exact opposite of appropriate, inappropriate, not just simply avoiding appropriating cultures or appropriating customs, but an active seeking of awareness and situational care of what knowledge is not fit for me to own as mine, or retell or use as a design insight, and to be willing to mark something as appropriate, not bad, not wrong, but not for this purpose. So as designers, I want us to ask what awareness of the situation, when might I be digging deeper on a detail that's really important? Ask, why am I learning this information? And how does my use of this knowledge or information reflect on others around me? It runs contrary to the idea that it's just a really good idea to accumulate knowledge, to accumulate data, to really understand things really holistically and deeply and put that all into our design work. And that then I have permission to kind of know it, to know the context I'm working in. And I think it's related, what I'm trying to touch on here is related to some of the comments that Peter West was making in his panel a couple days ago about when I learn something about someone else, say about an other, that I'm not learning about, taking knowledge from, now I know something about this other, but how does that knowledge, what did I learn about myself in that process? How does that reflect on me and what I then do with that knowledge? So understanding, I think, and differentiating between facts and details that we have learned and those that we can kind of know and use in ways that are safe and legitimate, I think is important. And the next slide, Sean. So the next term that I'm gonna use here is invisibilia. Some people might be familiar with it through a podcast that I have not actually listened to, but I've heard is great. Why I liked this term invisibilia, it's a Latin word and it means all that is unseen. So everything that we don't see. And we see this term, in the title of Lara's book, Designing the Invisible, and this concept of invisibility. So for me, this word comes out of combination of two places of my practice and my work. And the first is an ongoing project and work with my good friend and colleague, Isabella Brandalisi. And in that work, we are focused on how we highlight and celebrate qualities, like ways of working and being in the world, that are traditionally characterized through gender bias and looked down on as being inappropriate or for kind of professional endeavors or leadership. And how might we reframe these qualities as the exact qualities and strengths that are necessary and important response to creating the kind of social and structural change we wish to see in the world. And one of those qualities that we've explored a lot in that work is the quality of invisibility. And the second place that really brought it to this moment for me is a quote that was shared on the podcast Race Trader, hat tip to Bonnie Abbott, who shared that in our Service Design Melbourne Slack. And it was from the academic and artist Denise Ferreira da Silva, asking, quote, "Do we want to be somebody under the state or a nobody against it?" And the podcast went on to encourage the importance, particularly for white people or those closely associated with whiteness, of becoming a nobody. And talking about this in relation to our work here in service design and in this field where many of us share a similar positionality to myself, I'm interested in how we embrace a practice of becoming nobodies, a practice that is quiet and invisible. And I don't want this to be confused with meaning to try and be self-effacing or embracing a martyrdom mindset, but quietly and diligently creating space and support for a world we want to enable. A couple years back, Clive Dilnot, speaking to the Decolonizing Design Group, was encouraged invisible with, quote, encouraged in our design work to be invisible with, quote, "Take the risk of working with others and disappearing their own contribution," end quote. Or as my friend and the social designer who runs the studio out of Beijing and Shanghai, Make a Point, Jansen Chung, described in a beautiful speech, quote, "If you have a grain of sugar, one way to transform its impact is to put it in a glass of water. You'll feel the sweetness, but you don't need to see the sugar anymore." So what does it mean for our design practice, for us as individuals, to be invisible support, to be behind the scenes and not talking about the importance of our work? Another thing shared with me from a friend was a tweet from a young activist in which she expressed this sentiment. This isn't a direct quote, but she talked about, "I don't want the dream job, I want the dream role in my community." And this framing is just so, I think it really kind of speaks to what Shana was talking about earlier in terms of invitations. Not, do I look out on the world and I think, what's the work I want to do? What's the dream job, the thing that I want to make my mark with? But looking out on the world and thinking, what is the dream role that would serve my community right now? What is the role, what is the kind of support that my community needs right now? So I've offered this term not with a specific example of work, and I kind of have that question, and I have that question in my research actually right now, which is this something we want to find and share and fill with examples of work? In a way, can we do that in a way that's not praising or exalting that quiet, invisible work, but can share it with our community to inspire similar action, or does it stay invisible? That's me.
Thanks, Kate. This is really amazing. So much to think about. I believe, Reuben, you were Kate's discussant, am I right?
Yes, that's right. Thanks, Lara. Yeah, so much, Kate. Thanks. There's some really interesting kind of tensions there. I wonder if we should just go back to Kate's slide while we kind of discuss her work. But I just on the last point around kind of the being invisible in your support and not wanting or thinking about how designers can not be visible and kind of make it not about them. I'm really interested in the tension between that and working as an academic in the field of design and the kind of nature of kind of academic career, or like I've made a direct connection between something that I'll talk about, the tension between kind of me running a business within a capitalist frame and that very thing. But have you thought much about what it means to be a designer working in an academic frame and the necessity of visibility for yourself and the nature of the work that you're doing here?
Yeah, you know, one thing, and this kind of actually touches on something we talked about earlier with Shana responding with this idea of coalition. And one thing I've always really respected when I've noticed in academic work are groups of people who do their work behind a name of a coalition. And I'm blanking on the name, but there are a couple of designers that work out of Brazil, and they just go by their kind of they put their work out under a name that's not their individual names. So talking about their work through a coalition and through a learning. I know for me, I mean, I'm not quite in the academic trajectory at this point where I'm trying to get work and keep work, and like you, I'm sure, understand it from a capitalist running a business perspective, that it's in order to employ ourselves and keep jobs and put food on the table. But are we, I mean, I think particularly in talking about like what are the kinds of sacrifices we're willing to make to make the world that we want to see the change in the world, to see the kind of perhaps equity or decolonial futures that we discussed here. And I think, again, for people who share my positionality, that those sacrifices might need to be quite material in terms of how you put yourself out into the world and your work out into the world, that might have effects on future employment, that might have effects in ways that are kind of scary and uncertain. And that's, yeah, I think it's a real point to underline that it's not just performative when we want to talk about this. It's not just a performative way of talking about who's important in this work and where do I show up in it. So I think that's one thing. Like, yes, some of these sacrifices are probably quite material, but the other thing that I think in a kind of more maybe positive way is how do we work as coalitions, as research labs, put work out in collaborative ways that don't single out an individual and don't celebrate individuals, but celebrate the work that comes those coalitions between what you're doing and the organizations that you're perhaps working with as a collective. I guess actually, and a specific example of that is the paper that Shana published here at ServDes included Shana's name as well as students who helped with the project, who I'm sure contributed to the paper as well, and teachers who worked at the other organizations. So that kind of academic, like rather than a single authored paper, and I'm projecting here, I should speak from my own experience. There are projects I could write by paper, right, and be the single author on it, or there are ways in which I can invite in other people whose contribution might not be academic per se in a clearly academic term, but nonetheless are contributors to that work. And so instead of having a sole authored paper or book or chapter, it's multi-authored is maybe a specific example there.
Yeah, look, I feel like there's a really interesting connection between that, what you just said there, and your first kind of term around appropriation. I was going to like ask about some of the ways you might be able to share with us about how you go about, or kind of techniques or kind of tools you use to go about making decisions about what is appropriate or what to appropriate. And I think there might be some connection between who you're talking about kind of including in these coalitions and who is the owner of that knowledge, if knowledge has an owner. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And you know what occurs to me in hearing that question is that for me, the starting point of that is the relationship. So what's my relationship with the either organization or the individual in that work? How long have I been spending time with these folks? How long have I been spending time with this context? And all of that, that's a very dynamic situation in which, can I have a conversation about what's appropriate? Can the other people be in a position to make that call or not make that call? And there's plenty of projects where that you don't have that time. You don't have those relationships built over a long period of time. You might just have a single interview. And to me, the response is always to err on the side of safety, of not using, right? But that the ideal situation is that you are in a more collaborative, long-term relationship building process. You know, that's kind of the ideal that we don't always have. And that within that, you can ask questions of your collaborators, ask questions of yourself, take more time to understand what it would mean for me to use this. What does that, put it out there in a way that people can respond before kind of moving forward in different ways. And so it comes back to that same idea of what are the relationships, who's behind this work, how are they being recognized for their contributions and support? And if that's there, then I think we have access to more knowledge, really.
I'm interested in whether the other panelists have any kind of thoughts or questions for Kate.
There's definitely some questions in the chat if we want to find space to entertain those as well.
I have a million questions, but I'm happy to defer to the chat.
Yeah, I like Yoko's comment here, visibility becoming a choice or not, and be able to choose is a way to counterbalance privilege. Being able not to choose might be my continuous systems of oppression for folks who will and have always remained invisible.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think that speaks, I mean, it's a really different concept, you know, it's framed within my positionality in the world and the people that I'm speaking to who share that positionality. And that's a really different position than, you know, Lara, when you talk about invisible labor, that's invisible maybe by choice and maybe not, or, you know, that's a different thing than, yeah, the power and privilege of being able to make those choices.
Yeah, well, I speak of invisible labor not by choice for sure. Invisible in the sense that the system wants to basically dehumanize the workers and keep them, you know, hidden from view of the on an on-demand kind of economy, right? So it's not a choice for sure. But I do feel the pressure of visibility. We're talking about performativity in general. Reuben posed the question about the need for visibility. I absolutely relate to that and feel the pressure for a quite performative kind of visibility as tied to you know one's ability to move on, to move up, let's say. Mm-hmm. And so it's a quite nuanced question, I guess. I'm looking at other comments in the chat about this issue.
Yeah, there's a couple that I think offer the tension that's called out there also with Yoko's, which is, you know, efforts that go into making that move to invisibilia and moments where you're forced to do otherwise, whether that's moments within a project that force you to make yourself visible, thinking about the terms we're using, whether that's the kind of the Western notion of the creative genius that is kind of really encouraging and validating the idea of owning that and elevating oneself within that to even have access to work, from Kimberly and David, and then Antonio, which talks about kind of the engaging and resisting work with the kind of non-glamorous components of that, but those are the parts that are vital to actually sustain and maybe do the work that actually creates change. And how do you deal with those tensions?
Yeah, I mean, you know, listening to all of that, the thing I'm really struck, and the thing about that Twitter quote that I brought in about my dream job versus my dream role in the community, that to me is so inspiring, is it's from a very young activist, and I think she's in high school in the United States, and just that mindset. And so when we're faced with some of those, you know, decisions out there around, you know, but what about my, like, there's real needs, we really, as a culture, a design culture and, you know, Western culture, celebrate the genius, celebrate
we look even, I mean, within academia, and I do it to individuals, right? Like I look at individuals' work and I just like fangirl over it. I'm wired that way. And how do we, I mean, to start to change that takes some hard decisions, I think. And when you look at those choices of what is the world I want to see, how do I create that world? If, you know, I think that those are the kind of hard, tough choices we have to make around choosing what does my community need versus my dream job.
I mean, I think this, to me, Reuben said something where I felt totally called out in a really helpful way, actually, because I think it's easy for me as someone who does not make money making design except through my academic job, to be like, industry, which I have been featured doing with more words. But I think that I think academia can provide a cover for I guess the pressure that I think, Lara, I think you cannot possibly be the only person in this Zoom space who feels that pressure to publish or to be public or to be featured in ways that allow us to keep our jobs, right? And I think there's something really interesting and potentially some really interesting spaces of crossover in the challenge that I think, Reuben, you just put forward, which is how to understand, what are the overlaps essentially of that sort of the money we exchange for the idea of being the expert, right? I mean, in some ways that's an overlap between industry and academia. And I think there's something really interesting about, I mean, again, I think we can, not to go back to the idea of practice, but I do think that these are practice related questions, right? What are our practices of sharing? What are our practices of stepping, I think, Kate, you're talking about practices of stepping back that are in fact super considered and very strategic, even tactical. In different moments, it would look different, right? So to not appropriate or take on language or meaning in particular ways, in your first word, and then simultaneously to be able to sort of recognize when and where, what forms invisibility in this sense, right? What forms it takes for people with privilege, whether that's, academic position privilege, white skin privilege, gender privilege, et cetera, to contribute in ways that are, intentionally unseen or are seen. And I think there are all these really interesting things happening in the chat around relationships that are deeply seen in relationship, right? All kinds of people see that work, right? That it's not literally invisible work in that sense, right? So at what juncture do we begin being able to assign different kinds of value, I guess, essentially, and then to come up against the structural rewards of whiteness, of performing a particular kind of expertise, of male gender presentation, or I think something that you started out with, Kate, in talking about sort of even just the notions of types of leadership that are celebrated, characteristics of leadership that are celebrated. I mean, these things are so deeply ingrained, like these deeply oppressive, harmful systems, right? Not, minor discriminations are so deeply ingrained, they're often treated as kind of minor discriminations. And so I do think there's something really interesting about thinking about what other forms of recognition we actually have the capacity to celebrate, to insist upon in our business or academic frameworks. To what extent are we able to use some of that learning and some of what you're talking about, Kate, to actually challenge the very systems we work within and what recognition looks like, or what sort of, counts or does not count? Because the last thing I'll say about this and on the academic front is that the people who, at least in the United States context, who pay for having their work be grounded in their communities in the US are almost always women of color, right? And especially queer women of color. Queer women of color who lose tenure track jobs in academia over doing work that is based in community, right? I'm not losing my job for that, despite the fact that I'm queer, right? So.
Mm-hmm. Well, it seems like we hit a nerve here. Well done, Kate, with this incredibly provocative conversation. we do need to move on to Reuben's so he can have some time to make his points. And again, hoping we will be able to circle back to some of these very important, amazing conversations we have. So Reuben, please, Sean will move into your contributions right now, please.
Thanks so much. Yeah, I'm hoping there's a lot of crossover here. After hearing everyone, I'm kind of slightly intimidated. So much amazing work and deep consideration. And yeah, I will acknowledge that I'm part of Shana's industry kind of group here. So I feel free to be very critical, Shana, or anyone else. I'd like to talk about structure, deep structures, and this idea that comes up a lot in the work that I do and we do at Paper Giant, that there are these limits to what we would consider to be a good society or a good world, like a healthy, fair, just, sustainable society, held in place by structures that have often very little to do with a defined design problem or desired outcome in the work that's happening. So by way of example, this spaghetti diagram you can see on the screen is a systems map from some ongoing work that we're doing at the moment with some philanthropic organisations in the Australian Capital Territory. And this work is about understanding and mapping links between family violence and homelessness, more specifically links between violent adolescence and youth homelessness in the Territory. And when we talk about in design things like homelessness as being a problem that is kind of solvable, one of the things we need to do is pay attention to deeper structures like political and social, or even kind of accidental emergent structures that are hard to see that do create systemic outcomes for people or society. You know, the classic analogy that gets used is the one about the fish. There's a fish swimming along one morning and he sees his friend swimming the other way and he calls out to his friend, "Hey, how's the water?" And his friend calls back, "What's water?" And there's this water that we're all swimming in that we can't see, and it holds these limits to a healthy and fair and just society within it. And the work that we're doing through projects like this one is all about revealing those limits so that we can work with them or even try and mitigate them or remove them. So there's water that social services that help mitigate problems like family violence are swimming into. And just like for those fish, the water's really hard to see. So I'll give you an example from this work. So funding for social services in Australia to help people in need tends to be like commonly focused on really short-term and measurable crisis-related services, because crisis is where problems become really visible and where people are in the most immediate need. And so it makes sense. That's where funding kind of gets directed. But that means that community services tend to prioritise crisis response capacity and deprioritise longer term and holistic and whole of family and person-centred approaches to preventing family violence. And so what that means structurally is that in these crises, holistic needs aren't being met and family violence crises actually aren't being averted, they're just being mitigated. And what happens as a result of that is crisis demand actually goes up. So funding gets focused on those crisis services. And so if you overlay that with a competitive funding environment, which these organisations are also operating within, which is another kind of structural frame, there's services competing with each other for the money that's there, which limits any kind of moves for coordination or kind of coalition building or information sharing or cooperation, which as a result means less holistic health responses, which again means more crisis demand, which means funding tends to be short-term and crisis focused. And so the system that these services exist within is reinforcing itself. And so family violence keeps happening and young people keep ending up homeless and unsupported on the streets of Australia. People in the sector often talk about this idea of standing at the bottom of the cliff and catching people as they fall, but not preventing them from falling off the cliff in the first place. You know, this might, I'm not sure, Shana, is this an example of what you mean by a deeply oppressive, harmful system? The sector that we have been speaking to for this this project actually knows this is happening, but what they might not have is the language, and especially visual language, to actually connect it all together, to see what's happening, and to actually see what is holding them in place. I'll share this. I'll share a link to the systems map in the chat so you can have a look at it. It's a bit hard to see on the screen there, obviously. With the kind of caveat that this is we're only at the very start of this process. We haven't actually spoken to any homeless young people yet as part of this. So their perspectives are not visible in this map. And systems maps are also never correct or finished. So kind of keep that in mind when you're looking at it. But this is one example of what I'd call like a reinforcing deep structure that is visible or made visible here. And I think there's really important work for designers to do in revealing those structures as a key to enabling positive social outcomes and diminishing or mitigating negative ones. And the work there is actually to show the structure in a shared way to everyone that is represented and involved, so that they can see it in the first place, and that collectively there's an opportunity to actually agree on what's even happening. And only after you've done that, I think you can design interventions that will actually address the real needs of a healthy society. And so there's this kind of question that's always in our minds, or in my mind when we're doing this work, is what are these deep structures that are holding in place these problems that you might be facing as a service designer? What's really happening and why? And the answer to that question might be located nowhere near the place where you're actually working on a problem that you might have identified within kind of a defined scope. And so it's really important to look for these opportunities within the system to move those structures and drive system health, rather than look for design solutions. And so actually looking at those inherent tensions within those structures and how do they move. We can maybe move to the next slide. The next idea I want to talk about is the idea of mediation. I'd say, like, designers, when we're working, we're mediating action that people can take through choices that we're making. I think this is partly connected to some of the stuff that Kate was saying before, through choices that we're enabling or disabling for other people. We're either doing this consciously or unconsciously. And that's really important to consider when you're thinking about who gets included or excluded from decision-making within a design process. I'm using the term mediate in terms of all its kind of possible definitions. So it's about kind of intervening in a situation, which design through making stuff and putting into the world actually does. In terms of connecting indirectly through a person or a thing. So we connect with communities through representatives or through individuals. We connect with communities through making things for those communities to use or through collaboratively making. And also about mediation in terms of bringing about an outcome. This stuff that designers put into the world has kind of an agency. It kind of takes action on the world. And so through this mediation, design enables or disables kind of future possibilities, certain actions, certain kinds of interventions. And it's really important to recognize this, because I feel like this is a kind of an ethical intervention. The ethics of design gets expressed through this action. So you make stuff, it becomes an object that kind of expresses a certain ethics, a certain way you have of thinking about what should be possible within the world. And when you're a designer in kind of the environments that I kind of move in, you're working as a designer on a project, working with a team. Through being able to do that and having the tools of design, you might actually have a really inordinate amount of power, whether or not you realize it. So this image on the screen here is from a project that's working to improve justice outcomes for people in the criminal justice system in Victoria, Australia. Specifically people with cognitive disability or acquired brain injury who are kind of located within the justice system. I'm sure this is common in a lot of Western countries, but in Australia anyway, people with disabilities are really grossly overrepresented in jails and in prisons. by some measures, people with disability are incarcerated around twice the rate of those without disability in Victoria. The photos of one of Paper Giant's designers on the left, Kate Goodwin, and one of the client team we were working with, Dorothy Armstrong, working together. Dorothy has an acquired brain injury and she has justice experience, and she's been in and out of jail. She's a peer worker for others within the justice system. And having people with that lived experience on a project team like this is, you know, a comparatively small step in terms of kind of engaging with a very diverse community, but it's a step that really matters. But I'll acknowledge that there's a real tension here. We can try and devolve power that we have through co-design when we're working, but kind of related to my point before, projects are still funded and structured in certain ways by governments, often around perceived risk. And what that does is it makes the job of getting people with that experience actually involved in making decisions very, very hard for an agency like mine, and risky, both in kind of like a business sense, but also on a personal level for people that are involved. So you need the support structures in place not to traumatize or re-traumatize people. Those things are expensive, they take longer, they take much longer than ignoring it and sweeping it aside and making some decisions without including people. And the reason I'm focusing on the kind of expense and the time thing is for a really important reason. Is when we talk about things like decolonizing design, and I'll add a caveat too that I'm pretty new to that term, and so I don't want to, you know, kind of make any kind of blanket assumptions about it. But when I think about it from the little bit that I do know, we can try not to colonize spaces where we don't have the experience or the history or the right even to really have a say. But that's all sitting within this kind of neoliberal capitalist capture, and this kind of frame that I'm in as a business owner requires for my very survival that we go along with the colonial behavior of our clients, which are often governments. And as someone trying to do this through a for-profit and private design consultancy, there's this real capitalist tension going on here. So working with governments in Australia, co-design is kind of pushing against this mindset and forces that have basically defined Western civilization for hundreds of years. You know, Martina used the term institutional inertia. There's a lot of institutional inertia here, which is very, very hard to overcome. And so I might just leave it there. We can have some discussion about it. But design, I guess, brings these kind of tools that are really, really powerful. There's this power to kind of mediate action. And as people working in all sorts of different communities and different spaces, we need to be acutely aware of that power and where it lies, and try to use that power to redirect it and elevate voices that have been rendered powerless, and try and devolve that power if and when we can. I'm gonna stop there. Thanks.
Well, lots to discuss here, Reuben. Thank you so much for this amazing, you know, honest naming the tensions of ethical participatory practice when working in capitalist systems. I'm borrowing the words from Emma Blomkamp here. I think it really explains it. I believe Shana is Reuben's discussant. Yes?
I believe so. I will try to be brief because I think we're coming close to the end of this, which is shocking to me all of a sudden. So
Conversation is good.
We have about 10 minutes, 10, 15
okay,
minutes.
I'm going to keep this really brief. So thank you so much for that. That was really fascinating and really interesting. And I also want to just say again that I really appreciate this conversation across the different spaces in which service design is used and thought about, because I think some of these tensions, I think it's easy from an academic position to act as if these tensions are not shared, but I think that they really are in so many clear ways. So one of the things that really stood out to me in your two words was the question of time. So the long term versus the short term, the ways in which in the first sort of thinking about deep structures, the idea that crisis as the visible thing is the thing that gets dealt with, but the long-term problem that also sort of makes visible once you dig into it, as you're describing the long-termness of the systems that produce it, remain fairly invisible in that kind of crisis response cycle. And so, and then in the mediation, you also talked about the idea of the complexity of trying to improve justice outcomes for people with disabilities, while recognizing that it doesn't necessarily address sort of deeper and longer issues around, for instance, the hyper-representation of people with disabilities inside in the first place, right? So you're sort of naming these two things of a tension between recognizing these deep structures and sort of attending to mitigation at the same time. And so to me, it's a really interesting tension about how do we act in the present with an understanding of the future and trying not to undo the longer term potential solutions or potential changes. So I guess I'm really interested in how you all think about time in your work, and to what extent that figures into some of the ways that you're even trying to get clients maybe to think about time differently, perhaps.
Yeah, I could try to answer that by way of example, maybe on the kind of second project that I was talking about. Yeah, there are all sorts of tensions when it comes to time, because especially when working in kind of the public sector here, funders of this work want to be able to show impact very quickly in order to be able to continue to justify their existence, continue to get funding. And also, quick impact for people in crisis is actually beneficial to those people who are in crisis, and it's actually a good thing to be happening. So I'm not trying to discount that. In the work that we're doing with the kind of disability in the justice system, we're looking at different kind of timescales of impact in the kind of design interventions that we're developing or have developed. And so we did some of that kind of systems level work at the start of that project as well, to kind of identify where are some points of intervention that are likely to both help people in need and also lead to longer term kind of systemic change. And so like a really tangible example is training for judges and magistrates in issues around cognitive disability and how it gets represented, and how you can identify it and how to better communicate with people with that particular kind of disability. Both means that those people are treated better once they're in the justice system, but also means they're less likely to end up with a severely restrictive justice outcome, because they're able to understand what's happening to them and make better decisions for themselves within that environment. And when that becomes part of the general way of being of judges and magistrates, when it becomes part of their training that they get when they become a judge, then that becomes part of the way that the system starts to operate, is about being respectful in the way that you are treating people with disability within the system. And so it's looking at kind of both of those things at the same time, and trying to, within also like, funding envelopes and all these kind of things that are, and restrictions on what outcomes are supposed to be based on the way that projects have been set up. So we needed to have a digital outcome for that thing. So we had to find a way to do that ended up with a thing that was digital, whatever that means, Actually, it's about identifying those tensions and working with them, but also looking at both kind of tactical and strategic kind of views of, if we do this thing, it's going to put this thing into the world, which means that people will view this problem in this new way. That gives us opportunities to then do this next thing that might be more systemically focused or more crisis focused. It depends on what it is you're trying to do at that moment. Does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. In abolition work, there's a lot of focus on the inherent tension between addressing short-term crisis and not showing up the systems that produce that crisis. And I think it's a really interesting set of questions. Thank you so much.
There's a nice question about from Antonio. What do you consider structural barrier? Oh, I thought this was directed to you, Reuben, but maybe it's a good question actually. Structural barriers that you are constantly. I think you mentioned a few. You talked about funding coming from governments and so on, but I'm here thinking about my own problems in terms of pedagogy of all this. This was also, provoked by. I think Lisa Grocott mentioned that. How do we teach all this, and the ability to for new designers, newcomers, students to be able to see the power they have, also not to be overwhelmed. I feel sometimes there's a risk of being paralyzed, the conversation, especially when it comes through, when it's related to systems and deep structures, as you mentioned. I feel sometimes the weight with all that, we don't know exactly where to start poking, and students might feel will never know enough to be able to start walking around and working around those things. So I don't know, any thoughts? And I'm very aware of time, Shan. We have just a couple of minutes left. Unbelievable, really.
4 minutes.
Yeah. So I don't know, Reuben, if you want to add anything, or I don't know if I made any sense in my question here.
No, I'm not quite sure where to start. I feel like it does take maybe even like think about in terms of like courage or something. Like you've got to be willing to just start somewhere. Identifying, like you can spend all your time trying to map all the intricacies of the system, but like if you think about like the history of kind of design in any kind of space. You can never know everything about everything before you start, or you're not going to be able to ever start. And so I think it's about getting everyone involved comfortable enough that we can still try and do things that are going to change the world. And measuring and evaluating and iterating on that as you go, and making sure you don't just start something that's going to lead to a bad outcome. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question at all, sorry.
It's okay.
Are we getting somewhere here? Yeah.
I don't know, Shan. That's great, Reuben. I think you shared more than enough. I think we all could stay here for quite some time and discussing a number of the things that we
preferably.
Right? We just started to unpack. There will be no way we can ever tackle all the things, all the different cans of worms that we opened today. I guess. I wonder if we all want to do a last round of famous last words from the panelists, or if we want to open I don't think we're going to have time for breakout rooms in the end. So apologies for that, everyone, if we end up taking longer, but I'm sure you all enjoyed listening to everybody here. Shall we do a quick famous last words from everybody? Does that sound too much pressure, maybe?
That sounds good.
Late for that.
A little bit late, Martina.
For some of us.
You don't need to summarize anything, or you just you can say whatever is in your mind, or you don't say anything.
Any parting words?
Yes, any parting words at this point before you go to bed.
I can start us off with the final thoughts in my head right now are about how we all work in systems, whether they're academic or capitalist, that have certain values and structures that we are forced to work in and value in some way. But I'm thinking about how do we hold in parallel our personal values, and what are we valuing in our projects, and how do we foster and negotiate those values in parallel to the ones that we have to operate in. And the example I'm thinking about in my life that I work with a colleague of mine, we really talk about how we struggle. We both have volunteer roles in our communities, and we really struggle putting time into them during the quote work hours that we're being paid for, right? To do certain work during certain hours, and negotiating that we value this work more than the work that we're being paid for often. And so how do we show that value up in our own lives? So in that feeling of being paralyzed and how do I act and how do we do these things, trying to find those small ways that we demonstrate the values we're trying to put in the world within our smaller teams, have those discussions. How do we value those kinds of inputs, even if we can't get the larger structure or system right now to do that work? How can we do it in maybe smaller ways? And thank you everyone for such a great discussion. I really appreciate being a part of this.
Thank you, and thanks for this really optimist and nice bit of advice. I love that, Kate. Thank you.
I can say really quickly on the, oh,
Shana?
sorry, no, please.
No, you go ahead.
No. I was just going to say on the the getting stuck or being feeling unable to act. I think in teaching, I was just sort of catching up on some of the chat around teaching, and I think that one of the things that seems to have been working in my own class is being able to think through the making practices that exist in the world all the time. So especially in relationship to service, one of the things that I think has been incredibly helpful, I guess two parts. One, being able to disrupt the idea that we have to enter with expertise and leave with something finished that we recognize as something already familiar to us as a design, has been remarkable. And a piece of that is also being able to point out along the way all of the other things that are being made. So again, from a sort of education pedagogy perspective, this isn't about saying that that we undo everything and that we never make anything again, right? Which I think is where some of that getting frozen comes from. But actually being able to see the things that we are making as we make them. And for me, that has meant having consistent long-term relationships with people with whom I plan the classes, where I get to know, the folks with whom we're working over the course of many years, so that when I'm, so that there's both trust established and a sort of willingness to let people make things, right? To not have, there's a way in which I think it can create a space. So that combination of both understanding that many things are being made, and part of it is learning to see what's being made, usually through sort of reflection and thinking and discussion. And then the other piece really being able to have some relationships of trust that are long-standing, that are mutual, that let new people come in and be trusted, at least at the beginning, by proxy, unless they prove they can't be trusted. And I think creating that space allows people to act in ways that that maybe take more risks even in the very short time period of a class or something along those lines. And I also just want to say thank you to Sean and Lara for making this happen, and to my co-panelists and to everyone for being here.
Thank you so much. Reuben?
I just want to say thank you. Yeah. Thanks, everybody.
All right.
Yeah, well, I'm also going to be short then, because my brain is shutting down. I think all the discussions are really thought-provoking, and I was reflecting all the time on my teaching and how can we include all these things that we raised, that surfaced today in my own teaching. So I think sharing the document that we have with all the terms that we started making, maybe also others can add to that document. I don't know, Sean, whether you just shared it in the chat. That would be great, and then we can also build upon that and well use it also in our practice and in our teaching. And thank you everyone for this great conversation we had today.
Absolutely, Martina. Thank you for mentioning that. I put two links in the chat for everyone. One is a link to the slide deck that we used today. That is a Google slide. And one is a link to an editable document that we started that include all the terms. And we're going to add terms that have come up in the conversation today, as well as from the chat and some references. Please also feel free to add to that at your own discretion. And a special thank you to Martina for braving the time zone.
I think with that we close. Thanks again, everybody, for staying with us. Thanks for the panelists. Thanks to Sean, my wonderful partner. And thank you all for participating. I think the discussion in the chat was just unbelievably rich. And I wanted to go back and read everything. So we will try to capture all this and share, and hopefully this is it can stay with us a little bit longer. And I know that I've learned a lot today from you all, and I want to study more of the things that you said through the materials we're going to share later. So thanks again for the organizer. I think a shout out to Liam and Nicole as well, and Antonia, who have helped us in the background. Amazing work. Thanks for your invisible service and labor today. And I think with this, maybe these are the famous last words. And go on. Good night. Good day, wherever you are. I hope to see you in the next hours.